So go ahead, we'll jump right into questions, and then if we want to talk among ourselves, we'll do that too, but really like to get others' perspectives.
I have a question for Emma Daly. You talked about all the similarities between the work of your staffers and reporters, all the fact-checking and so forth. What would you say is the difference? What a lot of the tools are the same, but do you start with a different intent and want a different result from what you do?
Well, yes, everything we do is to try to end human rights abuses. So when we tackle a problem, you know, we start with the aim of changing it. We use journalistic tools to gather the facts that we think will make a strong case as to why, first of all, to establish that a human rights violation is actually happening, so that it can't just be dismissed as, oh, this is one bad apple in a police station torturing people, or, oh, this is a hysterical woman making it up. So we try to build a very solid case, and then we take the information. I mean, we advocate very directly. You know, we seek meetings with police chiefs, ministers, prime ministers, members of parliament, you know, generals, corporations, whoever it is. We try to have direct contact with them to try to persuade them to change their policy, to stop doing what they're doing. We also try to think about who's influencing them. So, for example, we'll go to donor governments and say to them, you know, you're funding, I don't know, a police program in this country, and those people are committing abuses, so you should be leaning on the government that you're funding and trying to get them to change. So I think that's really, it's in the direct advocacy afterwards where we have a very different role that I think journalists very rarely play.
Joel, in our pre-conference communiques, you said to me, Pam, you can't be a journalist in some countries if you're not an advocate. Can you talk about the various models or perspectives you see as a committee to protect journalists?
Yeah, I mean, I think another way to frame it is, you know, if you've been a journalist in a pretty rough part of the world, you basically become an advocate for yourself, for your own stories, and the kinds of things that you might do in order to report your story or to respond when something's happened to a colleague are a form of advocacy. So you might advocate to get yourself a visa, or you might, as an editor, advocate to get your people a visa, and that might require meetings with government and meeting with another government to put pressure. If something happens to somebody and they're detained, you might engage in that same kind of effort. Or you might mobilize your colleagues in the media to cover it, to put pressure on the government to do something about it. So a lot of the tactics that Emma is talking about, you know, the direct engagement, she's right. When you're doing it on behalf of somebody else or some larger, broader agenda or principle, it becomes a form of advocacy. But when journalists do it on their own behalf, it's considered appropriate and legitimate within the kind of broader framework of journalism. So it's a very complicated issue. And you know, if you operate in a country where repression and violence and intimidation are the name of the game every day, then every day you are advocating on behalf of yourself and on behalf of your colleagues to make sure that the information is able to circulate.
Can I just add to that? I mean, if you're a journalist, if you're trying to be an independent journalist in a repressive country, if you're trying to be a critical voice when a government doesn't want to hear that, then almost by definition you're a human rights defender. You know, freedom of speech is one of the, you know, it's a fundamental human right, and censoring and suppressing and harassing journalists is a human rights issue.
I want to ask the audience a question. How many of you believe the impartiality model in this country is stale? You're the ones I want to see at the microphone. Come on down. Okay, so I off and on teach a news literacy course at the University of Kansas. And Joel, I noticed that one of the groups you didn't list in your groups of stakeholders were citizens.
Because I don't think they care that much.
Okay.
That's why. I mean, I was trying
Well,
to...
let me
Yeah.
finish my question.
Yeah.
But in one of the things we try very hard to do is teach students and citizens how to discern propaganda from truth or legitimate information. And I'm wondering whether you worry at all, anybody on this panel, about that issue and the concerns people have about viewers and readers seeking information that just reflects their views of the world as it is, as they see it.
Well, sorry. I mean, those are two very different things. I mean, obviously, propaganda is a huge issue, and we're seeing the way Putin's propaganda machine has mobilized the Russian population on behalf of this very militaristic, belligerent foreign policy in Syria and Ukraine. It's had incredibly destructive impact. But that being said, those kinds of distinctions that I was making about journalism and activism, they kind of happen at the other end too. It's not always easy to draw a bright line between where one ends and one begins. The second point you're making, which is about the kind of self-reinforcing nature of the media ecosystem and the way in which people seem to seek out their own views. I mean, I'd really like to hear that from you. I see that as an issue. Doesn't get me all agitated. I mean, I think that and I don't think that I mean, I think that average people who consume information care very much about, in different ways, about ensuring that it's accurate and that it's fair and that it reflects certain perspectives that they might have or reinforces views that are deeply held. But I don't think they get all agitated about, you're a journalist and you're not, and you're, the way that journalists do, the journalists themselves do.
Well, I wanted to ask Jake this question when this 20-something in the Indianapolis Star stood up and said, when are we going to, as journalists, acknowledge that gay marriage is right, with the implication that she either didn't want to include the folks who were against the ruling. What would you say to her?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. Just as there was a lot of discussion in our newsroom around Black Lives Matter and covering those protests that were happening in Baltimore and Ferguson, or climate change is always another one. How do you cover these issues? I mean, before I get into that, I would say a few things just on Joel's point. I mean, I think one thing, there's a few interesting trends happening online, right? One is that there no longer is, there's a confusion or a blurred lines between what was once the op-ed page and the news section. Now there's everything on your Facebook feed, right? And a lot of times it's actually not quite labeled very well. And so one of the things that we've seen is that people want labeling. They want to know what they're reading, and that they're tired of just one side of the argument or being misled by something that is being passed off as news that's actually just opinion and not news. So I think that's one trend, and I've heard that everywhere. I mean, we go to high schools talking to, I guess they're called what, Gen Z, 5 to 18, high schools, talking to millennials, and I think that's a common thing, that in today's day and age, when there's just this one feed of tons of stuff going through your feed, you want to know what you're reading. I think the other thing that's interesting is that video is having its heyday right now, right? Video is everywhere, short video, long video, Facebook Live, Periscope, and what that has done has brought personality back into news and made it much more important, right? So I think just as much as people want labeling, they also are now following their trusted voices in video in a way that, there's new op-ed columnists, but they're through video now, and you're going back and tuning in and watching a personality that you really like at Mike or lots of other places. I think, and so I think those two things are working in tandem, but that if you know what you're getting, so if you know who the personality is, who you want to follow, and you know what their bias is, and you know what their perspective is, you're comfortable with it, and you're okay with it. But you want to know, and I think that's really, really important. And then the last thing is just on some of these social issues, they're really tough calls. They're really, really tough calls as newsrooms because, I mean, particularly for us, millennials, it's the most diverse generation. There's 80 million millennials across the US. We want to make sure that we're not representing just the folks on the East Coast or the West Coast or folks who have a certain political leaning. And the country is really diverse, and that's what we're seeing in this election is there's just so many different perspectives. But I think you can do the work of reporting on hashtags or reporting on the same-sex marriage movement without going the extra step of saying, in your reporting, we definitely agree. And that's what we've tried to do.
Sorry, I just wanted to come back to your earlier question. I think another place where we're seeing I don't know if it's exactly a blurring, is in the rise of government-sponsored TV channels like Press TV, RT, CCTV, where governments like Russia and China are making huge investments in global cable news networks, and where the reporting is absolutely not to be relied on in many, many cases. How those differ from Al Jazeera or Al Jazeera English versus Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Hurra. It's a very complex situation, but certainly they, Russia and China are making a huge play both online and in TV news to try to disseminate the kind of information that they want to be picked up. And, I remember last time, economics comes into play here a lot. Last time I was in South Africa, I was pretty upset to discover that on basic cable, you didn't get BBC or Al Jazeera English unless you paid, but you did get RT and CCTV for free. And, I think that's a worrying trend.
Yes.
Thanks, Peter Bale. I work at the Centre for Public Integrity. I'd like to make an assertion, of course, because you always dress up assertions as questions, but I also would like to get some advice from the panel here, because this is something we wrestle with every day, and of course in a non-profit there are regulatory implications of crossing the boundary between journalism and advocacy. And I also think there's a particular, I won't call it an obsession because that sounds negative, but there's a particular focus on that gap amongst journalists who've chosen to work in that space, and they have to be incredibly careful of it. So I'd like your advice really on how to address that gap, because to me it's about intent. We go into it with the intent to do journalism. The intent is journalistic. It may expose, there was one of Emma's quotes or something was tweeted about Emma talked about exposing or ending torture. It's not necessarily our job to end torture, it's our job to expose torture, and then it's the advocate's job to pick that up. And I'd like to know whether you agree with that, how we can deal with it, because personally I feel we're advocates for free speech, for the First Amendment, for the protection of journalists both practically and physically, and the sort of protection of the business model that we have to do. But I worry about my own risk of stepping into that advocacy world. Thank you.
Who wants to respond?
I will throw this back to everyone else, but I will say, one of the things that we were discussing as we were preparing was this question that I'm sure you wrestle with all the time in terms of where your money is coming from, how that shapes it, and then how you define yourself. Especially, so I am also part of actually a grant-funded initiative at the Los Angeles Times on education coverage. And it was specific to provide additional coverage of certain communities, of students' parents in Los Angeles. But it also, the funding comes from, part of the funding comes from groups affiliated with charter schools, which have a certain agenda. And so how do we define ourselves against them? How do you make sure that you're reporting impartially? And then we were talking about it, and it wasn't that different than what you're doing in the advocacy world, which I thought was interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is a question that I think has to do more with to a certain extent, with the kind of institutional culture you're trying to create within your own media organization. I mean, you may have completely different standards than, say, the New York Times in terms of the amount of advocacy that you allow your journalists to do, but I think you're still well within the parameters of what we would consider to be journalism. So, I mean, there's a separate question about you know, your 50c3 status and what constitutes lobbying and how much lobbying you can do, but that's, you know, very regulated and very clear. So, I mean, I think that, you know, again, there's no, I can't give specific guidance other than to say the point I made in my talk, that the line gets blurrier and blurrier the further you move along the continuum, but that each media organization has the ability to create its own institutional culture within the parameters of what constitutes responsible
Yeah,
journalism.
and I go with the Kovach-Rosenstiel approach, which they use shorthand VIA, verification, independence, and accuracy. And, you know, I throw fairness in there. But if you start with the idea that you're going to be fair, and where that doesn't mean disproportionate balance, it means, though, that you're going to fairly look at it, report it, and you're certainly going to verify, make sure you're accurate, and then you'll let the chips fall where they may. You know, it does go to the idea, however, that by, you know, pointing your pen at something, you in fact are making a judgment, and that you go in feeling like some wrong has to be righted, or something has to be explained or addressed that isn't. So there's always some degree of advocacy in your choices, but then I think how you exercise your journalistic practices is really critical to whether can, you know, retain your credibility, in my mind.
But I think that holds true for our work as well, because the reason that we're effective as advocates is because people trust our information, and that's why we try to build up such a watertight case. You know, but I also think Peter's right that despite the sort of long history of muckraking, where, you know, the point was to expose things to change them, for many journalists it feels strange to take that next step of actually trying to make recommendations. Although there is, of course, the whole notion of solutions journalism now, which is, you know, offering models for how to do things better.
Okay. Yes. Last question. Last question.
I've got a big voice, but not that big. Okay. Not to
One minute.
All right, very quickly then. Just not to focus too much more on advocacy versus journalism, but obviously the stories that you guys report on are fairly heavy. And one of the criticisms that we hear, one of the reasons that we hear for so much disengagement, particularly by Gen Y millennials and younger, is that they feel disempowered. They watch the news, it's just an avalanche of bad stuff, and then at the end of that, there's no solution. You're just supposed to sit there and feel bad about yourself. There are some new models around this, like Riot. Are you guys familiar with those? Yeah. Where at the end of the story, they have a little button there that says, do this, donate here, take this action, send this to your congressman, blah, blah, blah. If the audience actually wants that, if that actually increases the engagement, if that actually serves our community, is that crossing the line over into advocacy?
And we'll leave that as a rhetorical question. Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.